Good day, and welcome to Glasnost in Our Time, where we look at the world rationally in the hope that it will look rationally back. It's the 25th of October, 2022. The war in Ukraine wears on. No big changes in the battle lines. Russia has destroyed maybe 1/3 of the Ukrainian electricity facilities by now, it is said. All eyes are on the American congressional elections. Any Republican gains in these elections are bound to be seen abroad, at least in part, as war weariness with the Ukraine war, in view of the fact that some Republicans are voicing their doubts about continued support for Ukraine. Moreover, the election results will remind the world and maybe even quantify an ideological divide in the United States. Does this ideological divide justify talk about a civil war? President Biden wondered that a few weeks ago when he brought together a meeting of historians to ask them that question. Is a civil war possible in the United States? So how serious is the ideological divide? Is democracy at stake? Are we talking about a struggle? On the other hand, are we talking about a struggle between different conceptions of democracy? Those are some of the questions that are pondered in a new book with the stunning title, Civil War by Other Means. And there's a book by Jeremi Suri. Jeremi Suri is a professor of history at University of Texas, Austin. He's a historian of international relations. Maybe I could call him a kind of diplomatic historian, sort of a modern view of a diplomatic historian, not the traditional idea of it. I first was drawn to his work when he published a book on the 1960s and the revolutionary events all over the world in the 1960s and the effect it had on international politics and the development of daytime. So that I thought was quite extraordinary. Most historians didn't take that large a view of the history of the period. Since then, he's written about nation building, a little book about Henry Kissinger, which I think if Henry Kissinger had a choice, he'd probably say that expressed his views about as well as any book that has ever appeared on that topic, about the US presidency and about other matters. So welcome to Glasnost, Jeremi Suri.
It's nice to be with you, Tony, and I love that your show is titled Glasnost because we need more Glasnost today.
Oh, that's the spirit. Civil War by Other Means is about reconstruction between the two assassinations, the two presidential assassinations. President Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. President James Garfield was assassinated in 1881. And you make the argument, as I understand it, that this period of Reconstruction really ought to be thought of as a kind of continuation of the Civil War. So maybe I could start things off by asking you, in view of the enormous losses in the war, I think the latest estimates are something like 750,000 dead in the war. This is an extraordinary thing. And if I've got that right, that's more than all the losses in all our other wars. In view of that enormous loss of life in the war, that enormous punishment to all the families of all the people who fought in the war, was peace and reconciliation between North and South after the Civil War, was it impossible?
I think it's the key question, Tony, and I think it probably was impossible. After that level of killing, and let's be clear that 750,000 deaths or so without a single machine gun, without any bombing from the air, without any of the sources of mass killing that we're accustomed to in the 20th century. This is hand-to-hand combat, breech loader rifles and things of that sort. So the gruesome nature of the war, the trauma of the war, the destruction of the war, I think made it impossible that people would come out of that war and say, let's let bygones be bygones and move forward. And certainly Southerners, Confederates, were not going to accept that after all that suffering, they should accept everything that the Union wants. And this is really a central historical point. I don't think it's actually specific to the Civil War, The harder a war is fought, the harder it is to end it. World War II is a terrible example because it's one of the few cases where at least one of the enemies, Nazi Germany, accepts near unconditional defeat, and the Japanese accept near but not quite unconditional defeat. What happens with the Civil War, and this is where my book opens, Robert E. Lee says this to Ulysses Grant, that if you really want to win this war, you're going to have to run your army 3 times over the South. Our signing a piece of paper now does not end the war. Southerners had to give up slavery because of the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation, but they were not going to give up power. People don't give up power even after they've lost on the battlefield. Power has to be taken from them, and peace and reconciliation comes through long-term institutional change, which, as I argue in the book, Northern Republicans really were not as committed to as they should have been if they wanted true peace and reconciliation.
But you're saying, in effect, the Northern Republicans should have been committed to a military dictatorship in the South. And that is to say, they should have continued in the spirit of the war.
Well, the war didn't end just because Robert E. Lee signed a piece of paper at Appomattox Courthouse and many of his soldiers went home. As I show, many continued to fight. But the real point is even those who went home continued to resist. So, yes, it's an important historical lesson, right, Tony? I mean, wars are somewhat easy to start, very hard to end. And don't think the war is over simply because the other side has left the battlefield. It just means it's moved to another state. So I'm not necessarily for military dictatorship, but I am for a longer term, more serious military commitment in the South by Northern Republicans. That's the only thing that would have brought more peace and reconciliation sooner.
So you make the argument that the South continued the fighting, or at any rate, the Southern leaders, they fled to Mexico and made common cause with the regime of Maximilian and the French that had been established during this Civil War that was friendly to the Confederacy, and that hope that the British and the French would get together and support the Confederacy and break up the United States, have 4 or 5 new states in North America, and have a balance of power.
Correct.
That's to say, and that would have meant there would have been an imperial scramble at the end of the 19th century for the Americas, just as there was for Africa, basically.
Absolutely. And this is, you said I was a diplomatic historian. I take that as a compliment. That's the diplomatic side to this. The Confederate strategy was an international strategy. Initially during the war, to try to bring the British in to provide supplies and recognize the Confederacy, which would have been game over in some ways for the Union. And then after Appomattox, to provoke both French and British intervention. And let's be clear, many of these Confederate leaders that I profile in the book, John Bankhead Magruder, John Shelby, and others, they are joining a French-imposed royalist regime in Mexico. They are encouraging imperialism for just the reasons you stated. And it's astonishing that after that fails, so they've lost a second time, they come back to the U.S. and declare themselves heroes and are treated as heroes by so many people. This is why we need to know our history and why we need to hold people accountable.
So these exiles, they went to Mexico, and they made common cause with the French and Maximilian. And they even tried to set up plantations, you say. And they even had, if I got this right, they even had expansionist ideas. That is to say, they were going to continue. The Mexican War was fought over the independence of Texas. So they were going to continue in that vein with the idea of an expansion to the west, I guess. What did they have in mind? The northern states in Mexico?
I think they had in mind, yes, basically bringing back in what were some of the northern states of Mexico, which had become the southwest of the United States. They also had in mind going further south. There was a longstanding Southern interest from before the Civil War through the period after Appomattox of going into Central America, Nicaragua, and other areas like that. And it should be said there were even more Southern Confederates who went to Brazil than to Mexico. To this day, there are parts of Brazil where you can find people who speak English with a very Southern accent because they're descendants of those. So yes, this was an expansionist hemispheric vision, And just as you said, it was a vision that actually was about dividing up, chopping up the Union for the purposes of preserving slaveholding republics with European allies.
Huh. And you talk about the actual Reconstruction and how the black codes were put into effect and the rest of that. In Russia, at about the same time, now this interests me, the serfs were liberated by the Tsar Liberator Alexander II, and they were liberated pretty much without land. And that's sort of the same thing with the slaves in the United States.
Yes, it's one of the biggest challenges is that the 4 million former slaves who now become at least nominally citizens, they, in some cases, have access to wage labor, especially through the Union Army. About 100,000 are in the Union Army. These former slaves have now been taught to read and write in the Union Army. They become wage earners. I show in the book some photos of some of them who become bourgeois just in a matter of years. But the real impediment is just what you said. It's the same as Russia. It's land access. There is talk, especially from William Tecumseh Sherman and others, of reappropriating land, but that generally doesn't happen for two reasons. It's not actually the Republican policy. The Republican Party is anti-slavery but pro-property, so it's not going to reappropriate land.
But second, this would have been a kind of what would you call it, a Jacobin kind of.
Sure. It's hard to imagine.
Of the labor. It was Jeffersonian, I could also say.
To some
Jeffersonian
extent.
idea of a smallholders South, basically.
Right. You could imagine the breakup of plantations, and you also could imagine the appropriation of land from those who were Southern Confederate leaders, which would have been a significant amount of land that could have been turned over to former slaves, but that did not happen. And if that had been tried, there would have been even greater resistance to that. So as I talk about in the book, there are many African Americans who have to move west to try to get land. There's a whole series of African American communities that actually move from places like Mississippi to Kansas and Oklahoma, exodusters as they're called.
So in Russia, freeing them without land meant that in the end, when World War came, there was a peasant war and they overthrew the landlords. And this is really the thing that brought the Bolsheviks, well, with the war, of course, but the thing that brought the Bolsheviks to power. So the thought has occurred to Russian historians, to pursue this little comparative thing for a minute. The thought has occurred to Russian historians that if they really had a kind of Jeffersonian partition of the land among smallholders way back in the 1860s, that these peasants would have been more or less loyal to a, how do you put it, constitutional regime. At any rate, they would not have staged this whole peasant war. Maybe the Bolsheviks would never have come to power in 1917. You think something like that can be said about the United States? If this smallholder regime, you imagine all these black farmers owning their own land, that this would have created this stability and all the rest of that?
Well, there was some of that. There were African-American communities, and this is much of what Booker T. Washington was about, that became smallholder communities, built their own universities. That's how we have our historically black colleges and universities, in part aided by the federal government, creating black churches, of course, black businesses of various kinds. So there is some of that, and I think it does contribute to stability. That's the heroic good story. But the existence of those communities also, unfortunately, inspires a great deal of violence from white and other communities. And so it also becomes a source of instability at the same time. Why does lynching become prominent in the United States? It's the most American of crimes, right? And it is a way for white communities to intimidate African-American communities that they see as threatening them, threatening their status, threatening their power. So it does stabilize certain areas to have these prosperous bourgeois, if we might say, African-American communities, but it also creates constant violence at a low level. And one of the points I try to make in our book is the United States is a very violent democracy in the 19th century, as it is today, and we lose sight of that.
An interesting thought. It's a lot to drink in when you really think about the implications of it.
Yeah.
Well, how about these the, how about the economic issues? The central bank, for example, Jackson had a quarrel over the problem of setting up a central bank, but America eventually, I think, well, it didn't set up a central bank till 1913, but it did go up to the gold standard by about 1975 or so. How do those issues figure in the Reconstruction?
They're absolutely huge, and I'm glad you asked about them. So, first of all, one of the things that happens at the end of the Civil War is Confederate wealth is erased because the Confederate currency becomes worthless, just as we get the beginnings of the dollar as we know it. The dollar is actually the currency, it's the debt floating for the federal government to pay for the Union Army. And the strength of the dollar is inverse to the non-existence now of Confederate money. This gives Northern Republicans enormous power because they now have control over the financial system of the United States. We can begin to talk about a centralized system in the way we couldn't before. And I would argue the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 is the culmination of what has begun with the Northern Republican Union program. And of course, that's exactly what Republicans wanted to see. They wanted a hard currency, gold-based, that they could control from New York, where they would be certain of its lasting value, which is why they're against free silver, why they're against a lot of smaller currencies. The problem is, and this becomes a big issue under Grant's presidency, first of all, there's more money to be made through the use of this currency in moving west. The railroads are a great way to float debt and earn high interest on the debt that you're floating. So that's the bias of Republicans to invest west rather than to invest south, which allows more southern resistance. And secondly, what you do get from the 1870s until 1940, 45 is a very cyclical boom and bust economy. Where the value of the currency fluctuates quite a lot. And as I talk about in the book, there's a panic in 1873, which really undermines Grant's efforts to enforce the law in the South. The Panic of 1873 is because of speculation in railroads, similar to what we had in 2008 with speculation in property in your part of the country and in mine. And when the bubble bursts, as it did for Jay Cook's railway in 1873, there's more capacity in his railway than there are users of the lines. All the banks that have loaned this currency, this hard currency, they can't recover value on it. And so the economy sinks. And Ulysses Grant faces a Congress of his own party that doesn't want to fund the Justice Department that he's created, the military that he's using to enforce the law. So because of the dollar, Southerners suffer economically, but because of the dollar, Southern resistance prospers.
And you say the Southern resistance was more or less a constant through the whole period. And it begins with John Wilkes Booth, you say.
Absolutely. I think it's not all Southerners, it's not even most, but it's what we have to recognize in our democracy, that small numbers of people with weapons consistently use their weapons to intimidate people. And that is the long history of some of what we see today. But it's explicit in this period, and it has to be said, in most local communities, the support of local law enforcement. That's not necessarily true today, but it's certainly true in that moment, that many local police forces are part of paramilitaries designed and working with those groups like the Ku Klux Klan to limit access to power, not just for African Americans, but for immigrants, for Jews, for Catholics, and for many others.
And all of this kind of, what would you call it, fascistic kind of activity, the people who are perpetrating it thought of themselves as Democrats, I think you say.
Yes.
How's that?
Well, because they believed, and we have to, of course, as historians, without justifying or sympathizing, understand where they're coming from. These were white communities that had controlled their communities for a long time. They felt they had lived in the way others had lived before them, their granddaddies and grandmas, and power was being taken away from them. So they thought they were losing their sovereignty, and they believed in democracy for white people. They did not believe in democracy for other people. So they were defending white democracy. That's what white supremacy is at its core in the United States. It's actually not a genetic argument, because most white people in the United States would not be coded white in other places, right? Irish Americans today think of themselves as white. They weren't white until the early 20th century in the United States, right?
White had to be invented. Yeah.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
so that's just the point, right? White is a class status. It's a claim to be able to have democratic say among your self-similar affinity group in a particular place, and to bring in others who outnumber you is to undermine your democracy. Ben Tillman says this very directly. Governor and senator of South Carolina, organizer of the Red Shirts, which is a Ku Klux Klan sort of group. He says this very explicitly. It's not democratic if the majority of white people don't get to rule themselves and instead have to work under a larger majority of black people. And in South Carolina, you can see how he's concerned about that. So the real question is not whether democracy, it's democracy for whom, who should be included and who should not. And Tony, we haven't resolved that. We're still arguing about that today.
Yeah. So you see a continuity then between this period and today.
Absolutely. When my governor in Texas, Greg Abbott, says he's concerned about fraud in voting, who is he talking about? Who are these alleged fraudulent people? What do they look like? What does he think they're doing? And why does he see them as a threat to democracy? To me, it is a thinly veiled reference to exactly what we've been talking about in the 19th century.
Huh. Huh. So the way you put it, I think you said John Wilkes Booth understood democracy better than Alexander Hamilton.
Yes, because I think Booth understood that at its root, democracy is about allowing a group of people to rule themselves. It's not about institutional fairness or checks and balances or any of that. It's fundamentally about a group saying we want to, as a group, make decisions for ourselves. The problem is we don't want others to come into our group if that challenges our group decision making. That's exactly how Booth thought about it.
Uh-huh. So how about the liberals in the North? You mentioned Horace Greeley and Carl Schurz. I remember those gentlemen always being referred to in a very positive sense in the histories that I've read.
To some extent,
but you don't think of them so positively. Do you think of them as kind of, well, go ahead. Tell us.
Well, no, it's a great question. I have a mixed view of them. They deserve the credit they've been given historically. Carl Schurz, others as well. General Sherman's brother, John Sherman, senator from Ohio. Lyman Trumbull, senator from Illinois. These are friends of Lincoln's. These are men who supported the Union through and through, supported emancipation. They were anti-slavery. They were for free labor. But they also were part of a Republican Party that they created, which was a white man's small shopkeepers party of the Midwest and what would later become the sort of industrial Lake Erie area, basically from upstate New York across west through Wisconsin and Minnesota. And they were not necessarily virulent racists. They were ahead of their time, but they didn't see their party as being a party designed to represent African Americans. They were against slavery because slavery harmed poor or middle-class white people. And primarily they were going to serve white people. So you get this very strange moment where many of these figures who advocate for emancipation, who are with the Union through and through, they want African Americans to vote and have rights in the South, but not in their own states, because they don't want to be challenged in their own states. And they are a product of white male voting in their own states. This is a problem of democracy, right? That it's hard to change your electorate when you're someone who has actually succeeded because of that electorate. And that's the problem. And that's why they're far more committed to winning on the battlefield than they are to winning in the post-war, which is much more about racial integration and not what they're about.
So am I wrong in thinking of this in terms of President Van Buren? I think you did say that somewhere in the book. You said Tilden, I think, and yes. Van Buren had something in common. We have to explain all this, but I'll let you explain it.
Sure.
They used to call that, I think Van Buren was called, tell me if I'm wrong about this, a dough face?
Yes.
A dough face. And tell us what a dough face meant.
Well, so a dough face is someone in the North who basically is complicit, goes along with a lot of Southern Confederate behavior of one case or another. It's the opposite of a carpetbagger. The carpetbagger is the Northerner who's going down and trying to change the South with his carpet bag. The doughface is the person who's putting up with this and actually benefiting from it. And the point I make in the book, Martin Van Buren, who is the founder of the Democratic Party in many ways, he is Jackson's Karl Rove or David Axelrod, and then becomes president himself for a short while, a great political genius of his time from upstate New York, is the precursor to Samuel Tilden, who is the Democratic governor of New York after the Civil War, and the candidate who wins more votes than Hayes in 1876, even though Hayes becomes president, and that's a complicated story. Both Van Buren and Tilden are non-slaveholders. They don't have slaves, but they believe that upstate New York and New York City benefit enormously from the presence of slavery in the South because of the production of cotton and other goods that are sold through New York, sold in ways that produce a great deal of profit for bankers, but also for business, industrial leaders all across the state, and for farmers in the state. And so they are allies of the Confederacy. And when Tilden runs in 1876, he wants to stop any federal enforcement of laws that would undermine white power in the South. So they're called dough faces at the time because they're complicit with the Confederates. I call them dough faces, or think of them as dough faces, because they're complicit with white supremacy in the South. That doesn't mean they act that way in their own communities. Van Buren in particular, and even Tilden, are relatively enlightened individuals in their immediate communities, but they see value in the continuation of white supremacy in the South for the economic interests of New York.
For our viewers who may not have all of these things right on the tips of their fingers, tell us a little bit more about this election of 1876 and the role Tilden played in it, Tilden and Hayes.
So to this day, we don't know who won the election of 1876. This is an argument the great historian C. Van Woodward first makes about 2 generations ago, and he's absolutely right. Well, Woodward is right about pretty much everything he wrote 2 generations ago. And what happens in 1876 is Tilden, who's running as the Democratic candidate from New York, just as Democrats always want to run Southerners now, in the 19th century, if you wanted to get back into power as a Democrat, you ran as a Northern Democrat. So Tilden is running for president as the governor of New York. Hayes is the beloved governor of Ohio and running as a Republican. Tilden wins more votes total in the country. He wins about 40,000 more votes than Hayes wins. There's no doubt about that. But the question is, and this will sound familiar to listeners, about the Electoral College. Tilden has run up the totals in certain places, but there are 3 states that are super close. And if Hayes wins all 3 of those states, even though he has fewer popular votes, he has 1 more electoral vote, and he becomes president. The 3 states are Louisiana, South Carolina, and, of course, Florida. It's always Florida, right? And those 3 states are really in dispute because you have people who voted 2-3 times, so there are ballots that are excluded. There are also ballots that are spoiled that can't be read. There are legitimate questions in these vote totals as to which ballots should count and which ballots should not. Each of those 3 states has a Republican governor who's lost re-election, but still has the right to certify the election before the change of leadership. And each Republican governor certifies for Hayes. There's a 3-month-long, really, dispute then that occurs involving an electoral commission, including 5 Supreme Court justices. That deadlocks. In the end, a deal is worked out between Republican and Democratic leaders, and the deal is such that Hayes will become president. The Democrats will grudgingly acknowledge that he has more electoral votes. In return, he will not challenge Southern power and withdraw the last of the Union Army and other sources of enforcement in the South. So the South gets what it wants. The Confederates get what they want by trading the presidency for autonomy.
Okay, this story has been told by some other historians. I think you tell it with splendid clarity.
No, thank you.
But a lot of people are a little confused about the Democrat and Republican parties. Republicans run the South now. That's on a kind of what happened in my generation. And it was all Democratic. The South was solid Democratic up until 1970 or so. And now it's just the opposite.
Precisely.
How about the Democratic Party? The Democratic Party is the party of the South. It's the party of the Confederates. And how did it undergo the transformation to what we see today? That's a gigantic question here, but your book takes on big topics, and maybe it's a legitimate question.
Yeah. So through the 19 through the
a little unfair.
Well, no. It's a question my students, and I'm sure your students ask you. My students.
So yes, so I'll be the student here.
So through the end of the 19th century, really until the 1920s, the Democratic Party is the party of the Confederacy, and I remind people that really, even after World War II, but certainly until World War II, there was a long strain of African Americans identifying with the Republican Party, not the Democratic Party. Jackie Robinson was a Republican.
To be sure.
And it made perfect sense to Jackie Robinson to be a Republican. Everyone now assumes differently, but this is the generation before Martin Luther King, the generation before the Civil Rights Movement. You get to see change happening in the Democratic Party really only with Franklin Roosevelt, not Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is a defender of segregation. He resegregates the federal workforce. It's Franklin Roosevelt, because the New Deal coalition that Franklin Roosevelt puts together is white labor leaders, it's farmers in the Midwest, it's urban citizens, and it is African-American voters. Why is that? Because Roosevelt is seeking to build a coalition that will involve major changes in the nature of federal support for work, federal support for unions, federal support for unemployment benefits, and all sorts of things. And he needs the votes of African Americans to actually have enough in Congress and to have enough of a hold on government to be able to pursue these reforms. And so he reaches out to African Americans. He uses the Depression as a justification to argue that African Americans should vote Democrat for the first time because the Democratic Party is providing them with assistance. Less than whites are getting, but more than they'd ever received before.
But populism at the end of the 19th century, and the Democratic candidacy of William Jennings Bryan, 1896, don't they mean that there's a general, broad support, wage earners, trade unionists?
There's some of that. There's
small farmers and the rest of that sort of thing. That's more or less a Democratic coalition. Isn't that already pretty much formed in the 19th century?
To some extent, but it's actually still pretty white. Because lots of the many populists feel threatened.
But it includes immigrants.
Absolutely. Some immigrants, not all. Yes. No. You can see change occurring with populism. Yes, I think that's fair. Both candidate Weaver and William Jennings Bryan and others, and some of that is what's around Roosevelt as well, the Henry Wallaces and the others. So I think you could start to see that. But the real moment that you have large numbers of African Americans voting on a national level consistently for the Democratic Party really begins with Franklin Roosevelt.
Oh, for the African Americans, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so there we are. And then at the end of the book, you say some very interesting stuff, very thought-provoking stuff about visions of democracy. You say that there's a vision of democracy that one can hold that does not necessarily insist on integrated living. Those are the two phrases: a vision of democracy, you say, and integrated living. So those who have this vision would not insist on a fully integrated, and a lot of that is the integration that we were talking about in the 1960s. But you say a real vision of democracy, in fact, a dynamic vision of democracy today, would not necessarily insist on that.
Well, I think we have to recognize that there's space for many different ways of thinking about democracy, and that's one of the conversations that we need to have. I have a very integrated vision of democracy, but I think we have to recognize that doesn't have to be the only vision. I think what's more important than whatever category we have of integration is much more the question of fairness and opportunity and equality. And that's just my trying to be pragmatic to some extent. I think it's very hard to imagine in the Bay Area, in Austin, really getting integrated neighborhoods anytime soon. We don't have legal segregation, but we have de facto segregation by virtue
Yeah.
of economics and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
I'd like to see that change, but I think we could still have a vision that buys in some people who want to stay in their affinity spaces, but emphasizes equality and fairness, at least with voting, at least with participation.
So let's see, is there a language across the ideological divide, dialogue that could be had? Imagine you had a radio station and you're in Texas with a radio station and you're talking about these things. What sort of appeal are you making across the ideological divide there? What a great question that was, huh?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's, I do a podcast each week which thinks about this exactly.
Yes, of course.
This is democracy. And I think the key words in the way I try to think about it, and we try, my son is also on my podcast, so he is an 18-year-old, the way he thinks about it is in terms of opportunity and in terms of access. So we're trying to get beyond identity politics. I'm not necessarily against identity politics, but the problem with identity politics is it becomes actually a reinforcement of division and separation and categories. But we can talk instead about opportunity. And what would it mean for people who are different, who might see themselves differently and might live differently, to have real opportunities in schools? We can talk about access to voting, access to power. And that's how I think about things as an educator also. I don't imagine that students, when they come to a big place like the University of Texas, are immediately going to integrate and feel comfortable with people who are very different. I hope that happens over time. But I hope they all feel they have opportunity to get educated. I hope they all feel they have access to professors and to class. And we have to think about that. Are we doing enough to make that the case? I'd like to see us think about that as a democracy as well. That's the best of a inclusive democratic vision from the 19th century that we can try to emphasize today.
When I was a grad student, there was a grad student that I used to see almost on a daily basis. I would have breakfast in the student union, and this is at Cal, Berkeley, and his name was Don Warden. You may have heard of him. He's a kind of an obscure figure, but he had a huge influence on Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, Eldridge Cleaver, all the people who later on turned out to be Black nationalists and, to have a highly anti-white, well, I don't know, that maybe might not be a proper way to put it, anti-white, but anyway, highly nationalistic view of the differences across the races. And Don Warden used to say that white people will never tolerate Black people. I think it's turned out to be wrong.
Yeah, I think so.
It's turned out to be wrong. But he was convinced. He said, white people will never put up with the idea of living with Black people. He was a Black person, of course.
Yeah.
And he was saying, no, he says it's the whole aesthetic. They come from a different part of the world. The features are different. White people can never tolerate a Black face, he used to say. And, arguing this line, he had a huge influence on Black nationalism in the United States. But, I guess you agree with me that this is not exactly true.
I think the historical record shows otherwise. The historical record shows there's been resistance, enormously violent resistance to African-American integration.
And it still exists today, do you think?
Absolutely. But there's also been a great deal of evidence of communities learning to live together as well. We have both parts of our history. Why do we study history? So we avoid these kinds of simplistic statements. The world is much more complex than that. We shouldn't be Pollyannish and assume that you can put communities together that have historically been apart. Of course not. But we shouldn't assume that it's impossible just because we have evidence of cases where it has not worked. There are many examples of this, and I will tell you, this is what makes me optimistic. I see in my students so much progress on precisely these kinds of issues: sexual orientation, race. They're far from perfect, my students, but they're well ahead of where we were, just as we were well ahead of where our parents were.
Yeah, I've got to say that if it's possible to speak across this Civil War divide, if it's possible to speak, there's hope.
I agree.
just about every conversation I've ever had with people who are just on the other side of the moon from me, I won't specify all the issues, but sometimes it's about professional football. No, but I mean, who are on the other side of the moon, as long as we can start up a conversation, as long as there's something that goes across the line, it's ignorance and it's separation that makes the whole thing ugly. And it strikes me that the media now is in the hands of a lot of people on the right who want to form these communities, and they have formed these information communities where just about anything they say goes, and there isn't much thought to anything. And as a matter of fact, they can say something that's absolutely berserk, and people will follow it because they're part of this community. That's in the nature of a movement. I understand that. But it strikes me that if you object to that, or if you don't think that's the ticket, what you really should do is try to promote some kind of dialogue, some kind of discussion. You don't have to just say these guys are all wet, they're wrong, blah, 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 but you have to engage them in some way. And
I think that happens. I think that's the beauty of a university. That's really what education is about. And I'm guessing you're going to agree with me on this.
Yeah.
Of course, we want our students to learn skills to get jobs. Yes. But really what education is about is learning to talk, just as you said, across communities, because that's actually what's going to make you successful in life. And I do think there's a big difference in our world today between those who are educated in that way and those who are not. And that's where I would double down our efforts. That's why I believe in teaching this history, because this history helps people to understand those who have different experiences and work together with them.
And lastly, as to specifics, at the end of your book, you say you're worried about the Senate. We have to do something about the Senate, the Electoral College, the exclusion of the non-state territories.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, that's a big thing with you. And gerrymandering, and all these things. You say they're a democratic a cancer on democracy.
Yes, they are. They are. They've been there for a long time. They're put in place, some of them with the founding, some of them with the end of the Civil War. They're put in place in our institutions. The 15th Amendment is written to allow for continued exclusion of people, right? It says you can't exclude based on race, but you can exclude for other reasons. The First Amendment doesn't say that about speech. Why don't we have the same protections for voting we have for speech and for guns and for other things, right? That's intentional. These are cancers placed in our institutions. Sometimes the cancer doesn't metastasize. You don't see it. But it's there, and under certain environmental conditions and with bad behavior, these tumors have been expanded in size, and now they're threatening our system, particularly the ones you listed. But they can all be changed because none of them are actually at the core of what our democracy is about.
By the way, how do you change them?
Mobilizing people, especially a new generation, the same way we were able to get a 19th Amendment in 1920. You mobilize people. Here's the easy one, I think. It's not really easy, but let's start a movement for a constitutional amendment for a right to vote, written like the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law, states shall make no law to deprive anyone of the right to vote above the age of 18. Let's do that. And I know there'll be people who will oppose that. I'd like to see them come up with a reason for opposing that. Just a full constitutional amendment. That would get rid of a lot of the nasty business that we have in a lot of our states, particularly Texas, that make it hard for people to vote.
Well, fascinating stuff. This is absolutely a fascinating book. And I recommend to all viewers of this broadcast, check this book out. Absolutely superb read. What does David Kennedy say about it at the end? He says, a blistering good read, sobering lesson in the stubbornness of American racism. And what else does he say? Let's see. No previous scholar has written about the post-Civil War decades with more brio, passion, and courage than Suri. Well, absolutely. So this has been great fun, and but it has to come to an end. We have to conclude. Thanks to Jeremi Suri for an illuminating discussion, and goodbye until next time, when we will continue to ask the fascinating question, after we've tried everything else, why don't we try thinking about it?